All right. Thank you. It's good to be here again. Today, in the final talk of this series on political philosophy of technology, I'm going to revise my original plan and make only a brief further reference to Pierre Manent. Originally, I planned to devote this whole lecture to Manent. I mentioned him last time and had originally planned to draw more fully on his thought. But now I'm going to make an only brief further reference to him and instead combine parts of the argument from my Challenges for Science Policy and the Anthropocene, which was distributed in advance, with a little more from McIntyre in order to elaborate further on what I call the technological political problem. Manent, I think, is a really important an underappreciated contemporary French philosopher, so I regret not being able to spend the whole time talking about him. Perhaps some other time. It is necessary, however, to begin with a general qualification of my argument. What I have to say about the technological political problem applies primarily to the technological political situation in the United States, and secondarily to that in Europe. I make no claim about whether or not it applies to China or any other country. I must leave that for you and others to decide, to determine. With regard to Manent, I think what he offers is some insight into the reality of the technological political problem as it manifests in Europe. Manent is the leading philosophical political skeptic of the European unification project. To put it in the starkest possible terms, Manent thinks that the European project of unification is necessary but impossible. European unification is necessary because of engineering and technology. It is impossible because of politics. Let me elaborate. The political reality of Europe, as inherently of any politics, is diversity and localization. In Aristotle's terms, the first name of the good is that which is our own bodies, our own families, our villages, our towns, our languages, our countries. Any unification with other bodies, as in marriage, other families, as in villages, other villages, as in cities, other cities, as in nations, other languages, as in world English, is subject to the inverse square law of human affairs. In Europe, this finds large-scale expression in natural tensions between France and Germany, France and England, England and Germany, etc., among all 28 European member states in the European Union. I mean, that's an incredible project to propose to unify 28 historically distinct nation states. Science, engineering, and technology are all inherently in opposition to these particularities. The first name of the good in science is universality. Science aspires to knowledge about the way things are the same everywhere. The same with engineering. It seeks to use universal principles for construction. I've got something missing there. The same with technology. It mass produces a kind of universality, goods that can be sold anywhere and everywhere. There is also a second, what I would call an intuitive power law of productivity. The greater the productivity and associated consumptivity means consumer in any territory, the greater its deterritorial or trans-territorial impact. In other words, the more my country produces and consumes, the more its pollution and waste will affect your country, other countries. Even if my country conspires to protect itself from its own pollution and waste. In fact, one of the ways that my territory will try to reduce the impact of its own pollution and waste on itself is to actively offload it onto other territories. The waste dumping into rivers is a good example. The Danube River in Europe has a basin that includes 19 countries with 79 million people. The Danube is the longest river in Europe. Those downstream are always complaining about the ways those upstream are polluting or over-consuming its waters. The technological use of the river demands either war and conquest by one nation along the river who's complaining about the way the other people pollute it and that's using it, so it has to go to war to stop the other one from doing it, which has happened more than once in European history. The technological use of the river demands either war and conquest by one nation over the others who use the river, or some kind of negotiated dilution of sovereign power over the river as it goes through their territory by those whose country through which it flows. European particularities or territories came into repeated violent self-destructive conflict in the First and Second World War. And European statesmen, that is, nation-state politicians of an Aristotelian character, and we might also say a McIntyrean character, although one of the things that's kind of interesting in McIntyre is he doesn't really deal with the character and responsibilities of the statesman. He often talks about politics, but not, and he says politics is a practice, but I would submit that statesmanship is a little bit different practice than simply politics. European statesmen determined by the end of the Second World War that European territoriality had to be sacrificed to unification in order to strive for some kind of peace and stability, to recreate the long 19th century. The old post-Napoleonic wars, balance of power sovereignties politics had broken down. So at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, the European powers, France, Germany, England, Austria-Hungary, and others got together and sorted out who has power over what. So they created a balance of powers that held peace in Europe for almost 100 years, until it was 100 years, until the outbreak of the First World War in 1914. So at the end of the Second World War, it was very clear that the old balance of power system was not going to work. It had broken down with dramatic and drastically destructive results. The deterritoriality of science and technology demanded that sovereignty had to be diluted. Thus was born the European Unification Project, which took form first in the European Coal and Steel Community, was created in 1949, which devolved into the European Economic Community 10 years later, and eventually the European Union in 1993, with its central bureaucracy of the European Commission. There has developed a natural divide between cosmopolitan elites who either actively support or at least passively accept the European project, and those less fully urbanized who often actively oppose them. I've spent time in Paris and in Bordeaux and in the Pyrenees in southern France. people in Paris, at least who are urbanized, the disenfranchised, especially the Muslim lumpen proletariat, are not very happy with the European project, although they take advantage of it. That's how they got there as immigrants. But they also feel like they're mistreated by the EC, the European Commission bureaucracy. But in the south of France, I know France better than any other country in Europe. Well, I know Spain pretty well, and the same is true in Spain. I've spent time in Madrid and in the rural Basque country in northern Spain. The resistance to the European project is strong. Ramona could say whether that exists in Italy as well. It's pretty much the same all over the continent. Additionally, the United Nations was established post-World War II as an institution to manage global dimensions of the technological political. The UN has for some time been recognized by anyone willing to look with their eyes open as a failure, as largely impotent, which I would emphasize should not precipitously abandon for that reason. It still serves some purposes, but it doesn't serve the purposes for which it was founded. Even as we sit here today, in this room, the European project is under increasing strain, and yet it too, Manent argues, should not too easily, too readily be torpedoed. So we're in a situation where we have institutions that were created in response to problems, which are themselves not functioning the way people initially hoped they would. But we should be careful, Manent argues, jettisoning them too quickly, even if they are not functioning well. You don't want to replace them with nothing. Things could get worse. But right now, even as we sit here reflecting on these issues, the post-World War II international order is in the process of unraveling. Last month, on March 22, just 1 month ago, as President Xi departed from his visit to Moscow, included in his final statement to President Putin from the English language readout, quote, "Right now, there are changes, the likes of which we haven't seen in 100 years. And we," meaning Putin and Xi, "are the ones driving these changes together." I think that is clearly true. And as a result, Europe, which is under the thumb of the 800-pound gorilla, the United States, and its allies are trying to push back and maintain the status quo, even while recognizing, the American president is not stupid. He knows there are big problems, and the American elite know that there are big problems, but they are trying to push back against any radical change in the international order, what is called the rules-based international order. China and Russia want to change the rules. They don't want to have no rules, they just want to change them. But returning to domestic political issues in the Euro-American West, it is not only the non-elites who are uncomfortable, if not critical, of the reduced sovereignty in European politics. There are also some members of the cosmopolitan elite who have become uncomfortable with the dilution of sovereignty, the giving in of political sovereignty to technological sovereignty. The most wealthy and powerful of these elites try to escape both sovereignty and its dilution by creating their own offshore microstates in the form of mega yachts. See, on a yacht in international waters, you can do whatever you want. You can create your own rules. Their own offshore microstates in the form of mega elites, megawatts, mega yachts, or as some have actually proposed, floating artificial islands in international waters where they can do as they please. Elon Musk and others have proposed creating artificial floating islands of significant size in the Pacific off the coast of California, where they can create their own banks and their own rules and live, but fly in their helicopters into California and enjoy the California lifestyle as well, but effectively create their citizenship in a sovereign state that they themselves control, so they don't have to pay high taxes in California. And the people who own these, the oligarchs in both Russia and the United States, and I'm sure there's some Chinese who have these big yachts too. I don't know. They're not quite as much in the news. But I mean, these are huge yachts. I mean, the size of battleships, right? That are owned by these mega rich oligarchs in both the United States and Russia. The United States is, of course, trying to seize the Russian oligarchs' ships now, but it's not clear that's going to be successful. But this is the rich, their decision of how to solve the problem. The simple fact is that in a large proportion of the population in Europe finds politically unacceptable in terms of day-to-day living the ways in which the dilution of political sovereignty directly affects them. It is incredibly difficult for farmers in the Black Forest of Germany to see why in the world the EC in Brussels should regulate how much they can fertilize their crops, or for a small village in Austria to see why the EC should have the final say over how much water it could draw from the Danube to supply its village water system. And yes, that's exactly what is required if you're going to manage the Danube and the way it serves the populations in 19 different countries, 79 million people. This tension between technology-demanded centralized authority, which itself relies on technology, and local political affairs, or even to some extent, political affairs in the metropole, since not all cosmopolitans understand the demand either, and it is common everywhere to lash out at expertise and bureaucracy, is a particularly fraught issue in democracy. Manent, as the author of one of the most insightful studies of Alexis de Tocqueville's classic Democracy in America, and as a student of both Ramon Aron and Leo Strauss, has written a number of books that might collectively be called Democracy in Europe, extending Tocqueville to the present and taking greater account of the technological political problem. I thus regret not having time to consider his work more fully. As far as I know, there is no European political philosopher who writes with greater balance of probity and sobriety. Let's see if I can turn off this silly noise-making machine. I can at least turn off the noise. There, now I can still use the clock. A short aside on Tocqueville. Tocqueville was a French aristocrat who saw the writing on the wall, as after the French Revolution, The aristocracy and aristocratic high culture were, despite various efforts at restoration of what he called the ancien regime, democratization was taking place. In 1831, so the French Revolution had started the democratic revolution, but the French aristocracy pushed back and was progressively trying to reinstall its power, but it was losing. It was not going to win. And de Tocqueville could see the writing on the wall. And so in 1831, he made a trip to America to try to discern the historical power of the democratic wave and discern the future. His conclusion was that America was animated by two fundamental principles or propositions, equality and liberty, that were ultimately irreconcilable. In McIntyre's terms, they were incoherent. To maintain equality, you have to delimit liberty. To maintain liberty, you have to delimit equality. In his mind, in the United States, there was a tug of war between equality and liberty. In the United States, tug of war between equality and liberty. Equality would tend to be the stronger principle. And the greatest danger was that a mass society, in the name of equality, would seek to restrict freedom by means of a tyranny of the majority. That's de Tocqueville's term. He sort of created that term, tyranny of the majority. What he did not so clearly foresee is the threat to both liberty and equality that can arise and even to some extent be required in the shadow of a freedom actualizing techno-scientific elite. In other words, when the scientists and engineers pursue freedom, that can become a threat to freedom of everyone else and equality. But let me turn now to my own text, which uses challenges to what goes under the umbrella term science policy to interrogate what I think can be better thought of as the technological political problem. So now I'm turning to this text that you had weeks before I even arrived here and drawing on pieces of it. I'm not going to use the whole thing. Science policy refers to that amorphous body of discourse designed to actualize, rationalize, and or provide guidance for the science, technology, politics interaction, including scientific, engineering, technological, and political responses, especially to global climate change and other dimensions of the Anthropocene. Standard science policy work distinguishes two types. Science for policy, that is, the use of science in governmental decision-making, versus policy for science, that is, the state funding for or promoting of science. One good example of the first is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which was created in 1988 to provide policy-relevant science to inform political decision-making about climate change. An example of the second is the discussions that take place within governments about how to manage the portfolio of investments in science, engineering, and technology. Of course, in practice, these two ideal types can overlap. Note also that there are few examples of intergovernmental, in the sense of international or global, examples of policy for science, other than those among science policy scholars. The Anthropocene, or Anthropocene, I'm never quite sure how to pronounce that either. The Anthropocene presents magnified challenges to both types of science policy, but more prominently to the first. Bernard Stiegler is one philosopher who has written about this with a radical criticism of any celebration of the Anthropocene. That celebration among those who simply take it as a natural outcome of human power over the natural environment. Stiegler wants to call it the neg-Anthropocene, an age that negates or endangers us humans, anthropoi. To put Stiegler's argument in science policy terms, the world is manifestly failing to act on scientific knowledge provided by IPCC reports, issued once every 5 or so years, to address the problems created by the capitalist developmental capture of science, engineering, and technology. Instead, we have entered not only a new and newly recognized geo-global age of human engagement with the stability of the earth, but a related political instability. So for Stiegler, it's not accidental that we now live in a world of failing unification institutions, failing mediation by institutions between states, and mediation even within states between different interest group populations, that we are seeing these institutions collapse or become very unfunctional, certainly in the United States. And that we're witnessing the world environmental order become unstable with rising heat, global temperatures, ocean sea level rises, greater experience of unprecedented storms. So instabilities, we're experiencing them both environmentally and politically. The technological political today is characterized by life and death struggle between eco-modernist faith in an engineering ability to manage the new environmental political order and eco-skeptic doubt. Although I think both positions are ultimately impotent, the impotence of eco-modernism is obscured by its optimism and capital investments in its projects. With eco-skepticism, the impotence is obvious in its commitments to no more than small-scale ameliorative practices. Additionally, dividing friend and foe are contests of denial and anger at the unintended outcomes of nationalist-driven science and engineering, often emerging into an inchoate but powerful resentment against science broadly construed. In the United States, this existential partisanship can be sensed, for example, in religious fundamentalist rejections of Darwinian evolution versus effort to promote STEM literacy, in corporate economistic criticisms of research on species diversity and toxicological studies of pollution versus criticisms of neoliberal depredations of natural and social environments, in cultural conservative fears of biomedical engineering threats to human dignity versus celebrations of diversity-enhanced hybridization. All this tends to feed into a sovereign social belligerence over the nexus of capitalism, developmentalism, nationalism, science, and engineering, often simplified into effective tug-of-war over how best to integrate, not science, engineering, and technology, integrate or not science, engineering, and technology into the state. In the United States today, one finds significant public skepticism about the benefits of regulatory government, climate change denialism, and vaccine conspiracy theorizing that can be lumped together as anthropocenic resentment. Anthropocenic, both because of how the suite of phenomena emerge in the shadow of the Anthropocene, and because it is as such an element of the human, all too human scene, resentment, drawing on Nietzsche's analysis of how personal resentment becomes cultural power when the bourgeois masses, subjected to the rule of experts, ask themselves, to adopt a passage from the genealogy of morals, these experts are simply a self-interested class, and those who least resemble them, namely us, should we not be considered superior after all? Those who find themselves too weak to understand, too rationally criticize, or to heroically rebel against a situation they feel illegitimate, in frustration and powerless, easily lash out with a sense of grievance and paranoia, attacking notions of expertise, elitism, message as well as messenger, as stupid or conspiracies against liberty, and assert a counter-rationality of their own. Anthropocenic resentment is another name for what Stiegler terms anthropocenic nihilism. And my primary examples of this are Donald Trump, President Trump, and most Republican politicians in the United States today. The point at issue here can be restated by calling upon one of the founding texts of American pragmatism, Charles Sanders Peirce's short essay on the fixation of belief, written in 1877. Peirce distinguished between the sensation of doubting and that of believing, noting that doubt is an uneasy and dissatisfied state from which we struggle to free ourselves and pass into a state of belief, and that beliefs are what then guide our desires and shape our actions. So we don't like doubts, and we try to escape them. We try to create belief, try to turn doubts into beliefs. We had to try to fix ourselves up. His wording is so eccentric that that's one of the attractions of Peirce. He sort of creates his own wording for things. He then distinguishes 4 different methods for fixating or stabilizing or creating beliefs out of doubt. The first is what he calls the method of tenacity, which simply rejects cognitive challenges to any existing beliefs. So I believe that God created human beings and that they did not emerge from other species of animals because the Bible tells me so. And when scientists tell me that that's not true and they argue against it, I just, with great force and tenacity, hold on to my belief and reject what the scientists say as false. There's obviously a lot of this going on in climate change denialism and related refusals to acknowledge anthropogenic environmental mutation. However, since individuals find it difficult to practice this method of just holding on to their beliefs no matter what, there's a natural turn to the method of authority or tradition, a second kind of method of fixating belief. Insofar as people become aware of and willing to compare different authorities or traditions, but it is usually only a few, something's happened here to my text. There's a natural tendency to, the method of tenacity, it's hard to do that as individuals. So you lump yourself together with others and try to hold on to a tradition. But you become aware that there are people with other traditions So the second method of tradition, insofar as people become aware of and willing to compare different authorities or traditions, becomes problematic. But it is usually only a few individuals from the tradition adhering group that will be stabilized by such knowledge. Instead, most are more likely to double down and decide that other authorities and traditions are mistaken, misled, or misleading. They are not like us. This judgment can be directed especially at scientists who would teach things that conflict with established beliefs or ways of life, and already they're not like us. Research studies bearing out this phenomenon are legion. This is terribly written. I don't know what happened. I don't know what I was thinking when I wrote this out. But essentially, the first method is the method of tenacity, just holding on for dear life. The second method is the method of tradition, going not just what I think, but what a group of people that I agree with think. But for some elites practicing the method of tradition, they can compare traditions and they find themselves wanting something else, another way. And among cognitive elites faced with the conflicts of traditions or some other dissatisfaction with unfixated opinion, there emerges still a third method for moving from opinion to fixated belief. What's Peirce terms the a priori method, and strives to construct coherence among beliefs. This method is more appropriate to mathematicians than to empirical researchers. It is also not widely practiced by the masses. Most people are content to follow the American poet Walt Whitman when he declares, "Do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself." And don't simply worry about contradiction. So among those who try to follow tradition and become dissatisfied with tradition, the fact that traditions conflict, they try to look for coherence among traditions. What can we make that's common to all traditions? This is, for instance, what happens in trying to create some kind of category of international human rights or international values that transcend cultures. Okay, the Chinese have one set of values, and Europeans have one set, and Americans have one set. What kind of common value what coherence can we create that's common among all these different value communities? The problem is that this becomes very thin. Coherence is gives you a very thin set of beliefs. Peirce, along with many philosophers, rejects poetry, but has to admit that while pure a priori reasoning is, quote, far more intellectual and respectable from the point of view of reason than either of the first two, it nevertheless has the feel of a certain arbitrariness. Isn't there more to belief than coherence? Isn't it possible that coherence could also obtain among a set of false beliefs? In other words, we might be able to get a set of agreement about values that are all false among different countries. How do we assess whether the values are true or false before we worry about whether they are in agreement? Thus, among those who desire that their beliefs be determined by something more than reason alone, there develops the scientific method. Although only explicitly formulated by philosophers and scientists, it is a method that has vernacular forms used by everyone at some level in their lives, at least on occasion, in the form of simple trial and error. When further applied systematically, this scientific method, quote, has had the most wonderful triumphs in the ways of settling opinion. Example, you have one group of people who thinks that you can construct a bridge using certain kinds of materials, and another group of people who thinks that you can construct a bridge using different kinds of materials. Well, don't just try to look for the what of those materials agree. Do both of them use a few rocks, and both of them use a little bit of wood, so that we say, well, rocks and wood work because that's common to both of them? No, try the different bridge buildings and see which ones survive the longest. Trial and error. So it's trial and error for Peirce and these early pragmatist philosophers of science is the basic method of science, along with then coherence. So consistency and coherence versus empirical trial and error in simplified pragmatism. Yet, as Peirce's hierarchy of methods also reveals, the scientific method is one that is practiced only by and among the few. The many in any society, although they do it in part, they don't do it systematically, and they don't do it in all aspects of their lives. The many in any society seeking relief from doubt have and are more likely to rely on individualist bullheaded tenacity or trust in some authority. Peirce fails to mention the ways that brute force and violence can also fixate belief and be engineered through propaganda. Finally, Peirce fails to acknowledge that the glue of all social groups larger than the family or tribe, with their biological bases and genetic ties, are dependent on some commonly fixated beliefs that are not to be doubted and are not to be tried and in terms of seeing whether they work. Just insist upon continuing to try them until they become self-destructive, many of which are regularly challenged by science as myths or superstitions, most obviously perhaps by the social sciences of history and cultural anthropology. But what Peirce effectively proposed, and what his more political, philosophical heir, John Dewey, defended at long life and length, is that all people in a democracy should become scientists, or at least scientists manqués, almost scientists. According to Dewey's educational ideal, everyone should learn to cultivate the scientific way of thinking as the good life, making science their own. And this can serve as a secular, rational, social glue. If we're all scientists, we all agree. We'll get along. To adapt McIntyre's language, and I just take what we had last time, McIntyre's definition of a praxis. Science is the supreme, coherent, and complex form of socially established cooperative human activity through which goods internal to that form of activity, in this case, the production of knowledge, are realized in the course of trying to achieve those standards of excellence which are appropriate to and partially definitive of that form of activity, in this case, the methods of science, with the result that human powers to achieve excellence, that is, good methods of scientific research, and human conceptions of the ends and goods involved, that is, knowledge, are systematically extended. In other words, this process of practicing science and fixating belief through scientific practice just is extended to more and more of the aspects, the regions of our life. We do it not only in the production of scientific knowledge, but we do it in things like deciding who we want to marry, right? Well, you try marrying this person for a while, and if it doesn't work, you get a divorce, and then you try marrying this other person for a while, and if that doesn't work, you get a divorce, but you don't stick with it. You don't become tenacious. You don't say, well, there's a tradition of marriage in which you stay married for life. No, you keep trial and error practice in all areas of your life. However, there are good reasons to doubt that this is possible for most humans or even desirable by them. common experience in the difficulty of teaching science from K to 12 to university would seem to count against it. Despite the best efforts of the best science teachers, there are always a significant subset of a class who either can't get it or don't want to. The evidence is further strengthened by efforts at mass public science education, both formally in schools and informally in science museums and similar venues in the United States, especially since the end of World War II. Today, in American universities, science students are much more likely to gravitate towards studies and careers in business administration. It's number 1 in 2021, accounting, which was number 2, and marketing, than in math, which is not even in the top 25, science or engineering. So what you try to, Dewey and Peirce want everybody to become influenced and determine the way they do things by the scientific method. But people just, the majority of people just don't want to do it that way. Although enlightened belief in the benefits of science was a major influence in the founding of the American regime, the founders themselves admitted that the viability of the new political order was not a sure thing. The Federalist Papers referred to the new regime as an experiment. We might also note that opening the Declaration, I think I need to, given what's happening in my time, I need to, I said some of this last class anyway, but let's go down to the next page, 15. What most people practice most of the time is not science, not the method of science, but what social psychologists call motivated reasoning. They don't practice rationality, they practice motivated reasoning. They begin with a belief that they're already fixated on and then search for reasons to support it, right? Rather than looking at what the evidence may suggest and then developing a hypothesis, they have their hypothesis and then they pick and choose the evidence that supports it. In the words of one social psychologist, the reasoning process is more like a lawyer defending a client than a judge or scientist seeking the truth. Although the scientific method may be able to serve as a glue for a scientific community, it is doubtful that it can do the same for a mass public. Moreover, by creating a cosmopolitan community of scientists that transcends national science, science creates what some scientists experience as a fifth column in their midst. There's a strong tendency on the part of scientists to feel like they have more in common with fellow scientists in other countries than with some of their non-scientists and anti-science fellow citizens, and in some cases to feel besieged by fellow citizens. Finally, I want to repair one final time to McIntyre, who I think throws still another light on the problem. It is not just that the public cannot become scientists, but that scientists themselves are not able to produce the kind of knowledge that would be necessary to manage the kinds of problems that technology has now produced for us, and that on the horizon only looks to loom ever larger. We're talking about needing to manage the planet by means of what Brad Allenby calls Earth Systems Engineering and Management. There is what McIntyre argues, here is what McIntyre argues about management in Chapter 8, the character of generalizations in social science and their lack of predictive power comes into play. Now, I offer only selected quotes from my own outline when I read McIntyre. I take notes on almost every page, but these are few salient quotations that you can look up. Managerial expertise depends on successful social science, but successful social science has not been successful. But social science has not been successful. It's failed to discover any law-like generalizations and is unable to make sound predictions. In other words, social science fails as a science. if you're going to use social science to try to manage the politics, technology interaction that is going to manage the global ecosystem, you've got something that doesn't work. In fact, the true achievements of the social science are being concealed by systematic reinterpretation. And you have to go into the text there and look at what he argues there. But he argues there's 4 sources of the unpredictable in human affairs. 4 sources of inescapable unpredictability in human affairs. Radical conceptual innovation. You just can't predict technological innovations. The unpredictability of my own actions. I can't even predict what I'm going to do. The game theoretic character of all social life. We're all trying to figure out what other people are going to do before we decide what we're going to do, and they're going to try to figure out what we're going to do before we decide what we're going to do. It's sort of a infinite mirrors to try to figure out, try to take action. And this is happening on the world stage right now, because as Putin tries to figure out what Ukraine's going to do, and Ukraine tries to figure out what Putin's going to do, but they figure out what China's going to do to figure out what Putin's going to do, figure out what the United States is going to do. So everybody's trying to figure out what everybody else is trying to do before they do anything. But of course you can't do that. So at some point you have to take a leap and do something, but then that affects what everybody else thinks about what you thought you were going to do and their assessment of what they thought you thought. And then simple, pure contingency. Some things, it's just like quantum mechanics. You simply can't predict some things. But there are also 4 sources of predictability in human affairs. But the point is that the sources of predictability are not strong enough to overcome the sources of unpredictability. We exist in a mixed, go on page 17, we exist in a mixed world in which we are simultaneously trying to render the rest of society predictable and ourselves unpredictable. In such a situation, the best available generalizations about social life will be inductive generalizations that nevertheless fail to be laws, coexist with counterexamples, be unable to have their scope clearly defined. Social order is and has to be out of control. Quote, the fetishism of commodities has been supplemented by another, just as important fetishism, that of bureaucratic skills. The key point, key quotation from McIntyre in this chapter, our social order is in a very literal sense out of our control, and indeed everyone's control. No one is or could be in charge. Now that does not mean that they can't have influence and can't have impact and can't have causal efficacy, but to be in charge, to know what's going to happen in response to what you do is simply not possible, according to McIntyre. But if you're going to manage a global ecosystem, which is what the Anthropocene is increasingly demanding, you need more knowledge, more ability to control than it seems like our social order can provide. Once again, then, I'll leave it at that. I simply restated my thesis about the technological political problem. Okay.